Hello and welcome back to the workshop. Quite some time ago now I built this truck. I based it on a 1/12 scale F1 car, which was surprisingly fast. A friend recently gave me a pair of these F1 cars, so I've got the basis for two drag racing projects. The rolling chassis of this, with upgraded electronics, will serve as my basis, and the body I'll be fitting will be that of a 1930s Ford Popular. Just as its name suggests, the Ford Popular was an economy car. It had a modestly sized 4-cylinder engine and sold for a relatively low price. It was competing with the likes of Britain's Austin Ruby in the 1930s. It has since, however, become a mainstay of British hot rod building culture. I think the first thing I need to do is to get the body off this F1 car so that I can rip the horrible toy-grade electronics out and replace them with decent stuff. I've done this before and I know it's quite involved, so I won't be filming it. I'll come back to you once I've got the body off. That's better. Right, the next thing to do is to take out the nasty electronics and remove the Mickey Mouse Chinese steering servo. Here on the bench I have a new ESC, a steering servo and a new receiver. Let's chuck them in. Okay, I'll turn on my nasty new radio, switch on the receiver, and we've got steering and throttle. I've just fitted the steering servo with some 2-part epoxy. I've managed to glue the steering servo into position distinctly crookedly. However, the Chinese servo horn seems to be taking up the slack for us. So the car is now hobby grade, which means we can start thinking about the body. And the body is of course a great deal shorter than the car, but that needn't matter because I plan to cut off the front wings, the whole front half of the car, and just run it with a firewall or bulkhead out here. Something like this. Well, that's the hope. I'd better get on with filling in these gaps where I had to cut away the front wings. And there they are, filled in. This isn't exquisite joinery, I'll just show you close up. As you can see, I do rely heavily upon filler to camouflage the results of my efforts. I'm just going to show you how I reinforce the inside. You can also see that I need to do a lot more trimming around the rear of the body, and I need to trim the wheel arches to suit these wheels. Things don't look quite so rosy from in front because the bottom of the body sticks out. I think these 30s bodies usually curve in like that, so I'll have to make that happen with my choice of bulkhead shape. Here's the bulkhead. As these largest pieces of sheet metal are often stiffened with pressings, I gouged a sort of X shape out of it with a Dremel and then just backed it with some thinner stuff. I've cut this from the thickest styrene I have, which is 2mm. The body's quite floppy and I'm hoping this will go a long way towards stiffening it up. And there's the body with the bulkhead fitted. I found that the body was quite flobbly. Is that a word? Floppy, wobbly. So I've stiffened it up inside with these doubled up strips of styrene. So there's a strip of styrene interrupted by this piece as a first layer and then a single continuous piece running right over the top. The body is still fairly flexible for a hard ABS body. I don't want to put too much more reinforcement in it until I know at what height the driver's seat will go, because that, if it's a cross member that runs right across the body, will do a great deal to stiffen it up. And now that the body is stiffer, I'm prepared to tackle this horrible filler, which I've splodged across both sides I didn't want to try and sand it off before because I was worried the body would flex and crack the filler. I've stiffened it up enough to give it a go. So now I've been able to sand it down without it cracking. There's a chance that the camera is flattering this. I wouldn't want you to think this is a good job because it isn't. It's pretty horrendous. But I know from experience that I'll be able to cover it with rust and general detritus and grottiness. I just whipped the rear wheels off so I could get in with the Dremel and go around reducing the height of this sidewall. While I was at it and had the wheels off, I used a can of matte black spray to get rid of the Bridgestone Potenza lettering on the sidewall. I wanted to trim down that sidewall on the chassis because it's getting close to time to thinking about exactly how and where I'm going to mount the body. And obviously I'd like it as low as I can reasonably get it. I've positioned the ESC like this because these wires which go to the battery happen to come out here, and that way they reach straight down in there into the battery compartment. What this does mean, however, is that the firewall tends to sit on those wires, so I may have to relieve it a little. I'm not too concerned about that because there's going to be an engine there that should hopefully block the view. In order to get the body to sit down comfortably low, I've had to do some more trimming. The easiest way to demonstrate it is to compare this with the drag truck, which uses the same chassis. The body of the drag truck is wider, which means that I didn't have to trim away here. The body's wide enough to sit over everything. That's not the case with this one. As the Ford Pop body is narrower, I've actually cut a straight line either side of the battery box and narrowed the chassis as much as is possible without intruding on the battery box. It's just enough. While I was at it, I epoxied the on-off switch of the ESC to the side of the battery box. With the drag truck I was able to retain the original on-off switch, but I've just trimmed away it and its housing. So this one just lets the body slip over it. It's just narrow enough. Another thing I should mention is that while trimming the body, I decided I couldn't live with that slightly crooked steering servo. It wasn't that difficult to snap the epoxy bond and pull it out of there. You can actually see the marks left by the glue, and I'm going to glue it back in, hopefully straight this time. Okay, the servo's back in, though this time I used double-sided tape, and of course this time I got it straight. What about the body? Well, obviously I'd like it as low as possible. With the modest amount I've trimmed from the bottom of the bulkhead at the moment, it sits like that, and that's probably about as good as I'm going to get. Let's go round to the front of the bulkhead and have a look at how much we've taken off. As you can see here, I've taken away about ½ inch or 12 to 13 millimeters. It's almost enough, but not quite. I'll take out, say, another 4 millimeters and then see if the body sits level on the chassis. The 4 millimeters I promised to remove turned into something more like 10 or 3/8 of an inch. But as you can see, at last the body's willing to sit reasonably low to the ground and level. We've still got 2/3 of our bulkhead. Starting to get an idea of how the car might look once it's finished. It's going to be long. I've been tinkering around and I've come up with a way of mounting the body that uses a screw here on each side and a third here on the bulkhead. I'll lift the car up and show you how it works. Here we have a block of wood. Here there's another. The body's screwed to those, and they're fixed to aluminium plates, which you can't see. I'll take the body off. There's a better view. So these little pieces of wood are mounted onto strips of aluminium, which are themselves screwed onto the little silver ledge or flange which I left myself when I trimmed the sides of the body down. At the front, the screw goes through the bulkhead, through this little piece of angle aluminium and into the wood which backs it. The aluminium angle is screwed into the top of the battery bay. And now for the question of the front wheels. Obviously I don't want nasty Formula 1 type front wheels, I want nice skinny ones for that rat rod drag racer look. So I sent off to Tamiya in Japan, and they very kindly sent me these, a front and rear, because I could only get them all set, of Tamiya wheels. Now, I don't actually like this 5-spoke pattern, but it doesn't matter because I watch RC every day, and Josh on RC every day told us about these. These are the first 3D printed items I've ever owned. They're wheel covers that go over the sand scorcher wheels to make them look like steelies. He used them on his post-apocalyptic Beetle, if you want to have a look. They look great, and that's what I'll be using on this. Lastly, I ordered a pair of sand scorcher front tyres. Okay, the body is mounted. I've taken it on a couple of celebratory laps of the kitchen just to check that nothing's rubbing and everything seems fine. So we can move on to the aesthetic question of the front wheels. I have news. I took all the components for the wheels off the sprues, cleaned them up and sat down to assemble them, when I realised to my horror that they're actually bead locks. You need a set of tiny bolts to bolt these together, and that didn't come when I ordered the wheels. What happens is that this thick central element goes inside the tyre, and then once you've got that in, you sandwich it like this, line up all these little holes and put a bolt through. And then I thought, well, I don't have the bolts, I'll just glue it. But I quickly realised that if I were to do that, I wouldn't be able to change the tyres when they wear out. The tyres are sandwiched between the central core and the two outer rims and trapped there by the bolts. So the only part that doesn't bolt on is this, the 3D printed Shapeways clip-on steely conversion piece, which turns them into an ordinary looking set of steel rims. Actually, that bolts on as well. Oh no, does that mean the bolts I've just ordered won't be long enough? I don't think we'll be doing the wheels today. Instead of doing that then, let's have a look at the question of building a motor for this thing. So I want to fill the gap between the bulkhead and the radiator grille with an engine, which will of course also do the job of covering up the ugly steering servo. Now, this is to be a model of a UK built rat rod, because it's a Ford Pop and they were a UK model. So if it's to be a UK rat rod, why not give it a straight 6? Just as the V8 is America's iconic engine configuration, I would say that if you go back through all the great British classics, you'll find that many of the V8s we used were either American or of American origin, whereas we were reasonably competent at building our own straight 6s, and if we count the efforts of W.O. Bentley, even straight 8s. So a straight engine could just sit along here and cover everything up. So far my Styrene Inline Six looks like this. It's just a box which I've built around the steering servo without actually gluing it to anything. I've been working on my mock engine / steering servo coverer. What I've done is made a couple of little parts. This is thick styrene from the little door that you get on an electrical junction box, and I've rounded that off. And here we have another chunk of styrene. It's actually 3 lengths of 8x8 square stock, 8mm by 8mm square stock stuck together to form a sort of rocker cover. And that's how I'll proceed, just sort of sticking things to it until you can't see anymore that it's basically a box covering a servo. Here's the engine after I've spent a couple of hours gluing things to it. It really isn't an attempt to depict a real engine, and the components aren't even attempts to depict real components. That's the exhaust outlet from the Formula 1 car. Here we have a circular appendage with fins, which is actually a marker pen cap. There's the rocker cover. And here there's more stuff just stuck to the sides of the thing. The front will actually be covered by a cowl all the way back to here. So we'll only really see this much of it unless you sort of peer forwards. This large plain area here is where I'll be concentrating now. I need to put some intakes on it, and I also need some exhaust pipes. I've been experimenting with this round section styrene rod, heating it up over the cooker and bending it. That's my bad end. Oddly enough, the one I did second, the one I did first came out much better. I've put a bend on either end and it clips in reasonably well. The front one looks a bit nasty, that's the one on your left, but I'm not too concerned because hopefully that will be pretty much obscured by other stuff going on. Now I need to make up the 4 short ones which come out of those 4 holes you can see and join up to this. There, inlet manifold. I thought I'd have one enormous carburetor and stick that somewhere near the middle of the thing. So what does a car carburetor look like? Well, they sort of look like this. How am I going to make a convincing model of that, armed only with old wine corks, styrene sheet and cocktail sticks? This calls for a cup of tea. To make the carb, or carby if you're watching in Australia, I savaged this poor F1 body once again. I've already nicked most of the screws out of it, and this time I took a vicious cut through that white nylon block you see there, which seems to have something to do with this lump, and I took away part of that nylon, and that's what I'm going to be using. I'll show you now. This then is my nylon block. It's hollow underneath. What I like about it is that this hole goes right through and I shall be able to use it to fix the thing, hopefully, to my inlet manifold, which is still drying in the weak sun on the windowsill. And here you can see that I've drilled a 1mm hole through the inlet manifold to serve as a way of mounting the carburetor. So there's the carburetor. I stuck a marker pen intake scoop on top, largely to disguise the lack of detail on it. I'll just show you the other side while I'm here. I've just drilled the exhaust ports out. I've done some more work to the carb. It now has a throttle cable and a basic linkage. There's a little bell crank. The plug leads come back to this distributor here. I've also added an oil filter. I'm going to add the exhaust pipes to the other side of the engine, and then I think I'll give it a coat of grey primer to stop myself fiddling with it anymore. I gave the engine a coat of machine green paint, but left the carb masked off. There's the other side. I wanted to glue the exhaust on before I sprayed it, so I wouldn't be gluing to painted plastic. It does sit quite low in the car, but I'm happy with that. A lot of old hot rods with flathead V8s had the engine sitting very low between the chassis rails, and it does mean the driver can see over the scoop for once. So let's move on to the radiator grille. I'll show you what I want to do about that. Yep, the good old Ford Model Y is called into service once again. I've used this body so many times and I've never actually built a Ford Model Y. Still, this body is going to give up its grille, and that's not a complete waste for 2 reasons. Firstly, these bodies only cost £6, and secondly, I'll be cutting it in such a way that I can use the body from the bulkhead back and build something similar to what we're building here. So that's what we've got. I'll get to work trimming this and see if I can make it look right. That's pretty much the sort of thing I had in mind. But now we have to consider the thorny question of radiator grille cutout shape. There is a shape marked on this one. It comes down to a bit of a point here, and then at the bottom it's a sort of shield shape. I don't think it suits this cowl very well to have a shield shaped cutout when the cowl itself isn't shield shaped. I did try it on my Model Y based wrecker build, but in this case I went straight across the top, avoiding the widow's peak. When I built my Model Y based drag truck, I included the widow's peak. It went straight across the bottom. I considered this, but I think it makes it look like a 1930s BMW. Eventually I chose this shape. It's pretty much the same shape as I gave the Model Y cowled drag truck. Now to consider how I'm going to hold the thing on. This is how I'm going to mount the front cowl. Each of these is screwed to the wishbone, and the wishbones don't actually move at all. The car does have front suspension, but it's the plunger type. The wishbone stays still at all times, so this should be fine. I've been having a look at the car's wiring. I brought the wire from the servo down and glued it to the floor, then brought it up here. I put some proper plugs on here, admittedly. I cut them from a dead motor. I'm trying to keep all the wires down flat and low so that they won't intrude on the view when you look through the windows. And with that in mind, I've boxed in part of the rear of the body. I did it now before painting so that the glue would adhere cleanly, and I'm pleased to say it has done. However, I may come to regret it when I come to fit the clear plastic rear windows. I have no idea how I'm going to get in and glue those. I've done a couple of other things as well. I've used some fine aluminium mesh to fill in the radiator cowl rather than the stainless steel I've used for the last few builds, which is finer than this. I wanted something that looked a bit different. I've also used some of the aluminium mesh to make a mock radiator. The idea of this is that it will go here so that when you look forwards under the cowl you see something other than just suspension. I've just given the body and cowl a coat of high coat matte plastic primer, both outside and inside. And while I was waiting for the paint to dry, I installed my mock radiator just in front of the engine. I've been saving this top from a shampoo bottle for some months because the shape of this upper part reminds me of the shape of a brake servo or booster. Now its time has come. The first thing I've done is to flood it with plaster of Paris and screed it off, as it were, roughly with the back of a straight knife. So I'll have a decent surface area to glue it to the firewall when it's done. Once I'd screeded off my plaster of Paris, I was able to glue to the back of the shampoo bottle lid this circle of styrene from the junction box lid, and to that I've just added the basic elements that go to make up a brake master cylinder. It's all just styrene. Here you can also see the clutch master cylinder with the flange made from junction box lid because it's a good source of cheap styrene. They'll go on the bulkhead once I've painted the whole car, and that brings to mind a problem. I can't decide what colour to paint it. Last time I was in this quandary, I was building my 6x6 1950s truck, and I eventually settled for a kind of very pale blue, which with rust did come out looking good. My wife suggested a pale pastel green for this car, but as the engine's green, I'm not happy with that. For the moment, this is how the car looks. The grille's still masked off because I want to leave it till I've completely painted everything before I reveal it, in case I like the way it looks against the paint job that I eventually come up with. And you can just glimpse the radiator, which I've stuck under the cowl. To take it off, you can see it much more clearly. But the idea is it's just a shadowy suggestion of stuff going on under there. And after a quick coat of paint, they're both ready to go on the bulkhead when required. As these reservoirs are made of white plastic that often yellows slightly with age, I've put a tinge of yellow in with the white paint I use for this. Otherwise it's just silver for the rim around the back, matte black, and a darker silver for there. And there's the clutch master cylinder. Here's a rudimentary dashboard. So far it's just 4 holes and a glove box lid. I think I'll keep it quite simple because these old trucks didn't have all that much instrumentation. I have come up against something of a snag. I can't glaze the windows, fit the driver figure, or even paint the dashboard until I've decided upon a body colour. I explained my quandary to my wife, who at first suggested a dark green. The trouble is this car has a green engine, and I did my drag truck dark green, but I bought a can of green spray as a possibility. When I mentioned the fact that the engine's green and that I didn't want an all-green car, she suggested red. So I bought a can of red, and then I sat down and looked at some real rat rods on YouTube, and I saw one which was beige but heavily rusted, and I rather like that, so I bought a can of beige. However, I'm still no closer to a final decision. That doesn't actually matter for the moment, as if I'm to use the salt technique, the first thing for me to do is to paint the body in a variety of rusty colours. No sooner said than done. I rummaged through my milk crate full of half-used cans of spray paint and found a brown called tobacco and some orange. That's all I could find that would help create a rusty pre-effect. And then I remembered the package which arrived yesterday and which I had hoped to be the tiny bolts for the sand scorcher front wheels. But no, it was this. It's by a company called Folk Art. The range is called Painted Finishes, and here it says Rust. So I've got to sit down and read the instructions and try it on a test piece. I suppose I should get a piece of styrene that's painted the same colour and start with that. Before I tackle the Folk Art Painted Finishes two-stage rust finish system, I'm going to weather the engine because I already know how to do that, and because I'd like time today to leave it out in the sun to dry. I'll use some dark acrylic paints mixed together and mixed with a great deal of water to create a simple wash which will hopefully gather in any crevices, nooks and crannies. Okay, I'll just shove this everywhere and then wipe it off the high spots. Here's my test piece. I took a piece of 1mm styrene, sprayed it with the high coat red matte primer I've been using, and then went to town on it using the system, which consists basically of 2 pots of acrylic paint of slightly different colours. It's not awful, and I'm sure the fault lies not with the product but with my inexperience with its use, but in this case I must say that it actually looks less convincing to me than the finish I've already attained using my own methods. So I'm going to go with that. I also used the Folk Art 2-part rusting system on the sides of the engine, and here I do rather like the effect that it's had. The next question I'm asking myself is, should I salt and spray it, or should I just leave it as it is? After a lot of thought, I've decided to salt it very heavily so that most of the finish will be this rust, and spray it red. I used so much salt on the roof that you can hardly see that it's been painted red, which is exactly the effect I wanted, and I've continued that all over the body. Here, for example, is the cowl. Same sort of deal, I only painted the red onto the top, the sides were as we left them. I've used acrylic paint to dirty up the suspension system, which will be very much on display, and I've also splodged some dirt around inside the radiator area. I painted the inside of the cowl matte black, so it's dried gloss oddly, to make it darker in there, and just so that it's more difficult to see that there's a lot of stuff missing, like no fan, etc. So next I need to finish the dashboard and glue that in. Then I'll be able to glue in the windows, and once I've done that I can glue in the driver. Here's the dash, now that I've added some switches, a choke pull and a catch for the glove box. The switches are just pieces of wire heated and pushed through. As you push them through, the plastic swells up around the hole, so it looks like a bezel or switch base. The choke pull is simply a cocktail stick whose end has been carved to look vaguely like a choke pull. And the same goes for the glove box release. It's just a 1mm thick wooden cocktail stick painted silver. When it comes to door shut lines and panel lines in general on these models, I've always drawn them on, with one exception. With my Ford Taunus I did try carving them into the body with the edge of a Dremel disc, but it wasn't pretty. I went back to drawing them on, but the other day I recently bought this. It's a cheap single speed engraver. I thought I'd try it out on a piece of scrap styrene. It seems to work. So what I've done is mask off the radiator grille from the rest of the cowl to give me a line to work with. And I'm going to have a go at this first. If this works, then I think I'll try and do the doors. That came out quite well. It left it stark staring white, so I had to fill it in with a very fine marker pen. But in future, on future builds, if I do this first before I spray the bodies, I should have some really relatively convincing looking panel lines. Well, that seems to work quite well. That's what they look like once I've given them a go with the marker pen. In the future, as I said before, I hope that the paint will sink into the declivity and it will still show, and there'll be no need to colour them in at all. This is great. Camtech bodies have always been the poor man's way to make a hot rod, but the ability to add panel lines really helps push these cheap ABS bodies up towards the level of realism that can be offered by the, to me, utterly unaffordable 3D printed bodies. I recently saw a video by a guy who does static car modelling, and he simulated rust by using an acrylic paint of an appropriate colour as a sort of glue and then sprinkling onto that cinnamon. So I've been experimenting along similar lines, and these are my initial results. I have been enjoying myself playing with the cinnamon, but I really need to focus on trying to glaze these windows. I'm going to do the back middle one first. I think the back side ones will be the hardest. The windows are in. I've managed to do the back side ones. It wasn't easy. Front and screen, and as I've never made a dashboard before for one of these rat rods, I thought I'd leave the driver's side window open so that we can see it. Here we have a release for the boot or trunk lid. I found I became better at simulating rust using cinnamon the more I practiced. Here we have it on the firewall after I learned a little about using it, and it does look quite good. So here I'm going to improvise a sort of filler neck with a chrome cap on top. These things are sold in the UK as paper fasteners. The reason why it's of interest to us is this chrome top, which is going to form our fuel filler cap. Here's the fuel filler. 1/12 scale is about 2mm to the inch, so I used a piece of 4mm styrene round rod to give me a 2-inch thick filler neck, and capped it with the head from the paper fastener, suitably dulled down so it doesn't look too shiny and new. The interior was full of bright colourful wires. I didn't want them, so I've painted everything black with acrylic, which just flakes off if you bend the wires, but it should keep it darker in there for now. I think it's time for us to choose a driver figure. This lady is Amanita from the Netflix TV show Sense8. I've actually chosen her because she's not particularly tall, and owing to my strange psychological inability to harm female action figures, I won't be able to cut her off to fit her in. I usually save female drivers for projects where I'll be able to fit them into the vehicle without having to cut their legs off. So if she goes in, she gets to drive it. If she doesn't, she'll have to hand over the post to a guy whose legs I won't mind chopping off with a carving knife. Well, the sad truth is that Amanita from Sense8 doesn't fit in the cab. I'd have had to cut her to get her in, or have her leaning back so far that her face was smushed against the inside of the roof. So she'll have to drive something else someday. And while I deal with the bitter disappointment, I've been making backlights. So each of these will form a backing for a backlight. They're 2mm thick, so that's 6mm or 1/4 of an inch, and these tiny things will eventually become door handle. Here are 3 pieces of 2mm styrene glued together, so that's 1/4 inch thick, and these are actually cut from a full-size vehicle's rear light lens. And here are the 2 lights. They just need painting and to be stuck on. And this is how far I've got with the door handles. The matchstick's just there to give you an idea of the size of them. Here are the back lights finished and fitted, and this is one of the door handles fitted, looking down on it from above. Still no sign of the tiny bolts for the front wheels, but apart from the front wheels, the only things I can think of left to do are the headlights and the driver figure. Here's one of the lights, cut from the tip of this marker pen. And lined with aluminium foil. Here's the beginnings of a scale battery, and now here it is once it's had a coat of paint. I'll be putting the battery here with a couple of wires coming off it, going back behind it and disappearing. I've fitted the headlights. All I can think of to do now is to fit the driver, which means I have to make a decision. Here we have our driver figure. I'm going to cut him in half, mount him on a piece of wood and get him installed inside the body. I've cut the driver and glued him to a stick which will go across the inside of the body. But while that glue's drying, I've just knocked up this quick steering wheel from a length of electrical cable, a piece of styrene and a drawing pin. The driver's in position, holding his steering wheel. I've added a hose to the radiator. Let's take a step back and take a moment to examine our progress. This is how it looks with the battery installed and the headlights and door handles. Let's have a look at the back. There are the rear lights and the fuel filler. There's really only one thing left to do, and that is to change the front wheels. But there's still no sign of the tiny bolts. However, I do have an alternative plan. At first I considered this Camtech Jaguar wheel, but the tyre profile's too low and the tyres are foams. But if we have a look at these Charisma wheels, they're nearer to the diameter of these and they have a nice high profile. I also like the wheel design because it mimics a steel rather than an aluminium wheel. However, it won't be easy to fit these. They've got no bearings, and these have a 5mm shaft. My plan is to drill out a 12mm wheel hex for each side to the right size and use them as bushes. This is an original front wheel bush from the F1 car. This hex is only 9mm, so I can't use it. This is a 5.5mm drill bit shank. It goes in, but it wobbles in there. So we know that the spindle is at least 5.5mm. Now, is it as big as 6? No, that won't fit in there. So I know it's between 5.5 and 6mm in diameter. What I'm going to do then is take this brand new drill bit, put it in the drill press, spin it up and attack it with the flat of a cutting disc until its diameter is reduced to a point where it will fit exactly into this bush. At that point I use that drill bit to drill out my black 12mm hexes, and they will then serve as bushes. They drilled out quite easily using a 12mm ring spanner to hold them in place and using a drill press to make sure it's nice and square. They pop on like this. The wheel goes over them. I think I'm going to have to lightly glue the hex into the wheel well somehow, because otherwise there's nothing to stop the hex drifting out and the wheel suddenly ending up with no bush. Obviously I need to be able to get these hexes out so that I can change them when they wear, because I'm using them as bushes. So I didn't want to fix them in too permanently, so I ignored the super glue and the epoxy and the solvent cement, and I went for the tiniest dab of wood glue on every other face of the hex before I pushed it in. After I did that I realised I could just have spaced here. I could have put a couple of drilled out 6mm nuts or something here to stop the bush coming along, but I've glued them in now. I've given the wheels a coat of rusty paint each. Having recognised at last that gluing the bushes into place with PVA was a very silly idea, I quickly pulled them out before the glue went off and replaced them with a pair of spacers made from the outside of a pen. I did say previously that once the wheels were on, we'd be finished, but I'd forgotten that I need to fix the brake servo and master cylinder and the clutch master cylinder to the bulkhead before we can call the car finished. Here then is the bulkhead with the master cylinder and its plumbing and the slave cylinder glued on very slightly crookedly next to it. One last tiny job. Right, apart from painting in that piece of white plastic that I didn't know about, I hereby declare this rat rod finished. Too big a rocket. Oh look, it's coming back!
It's going to go off down the hill.
Is it going forwards or backwards?
Go forward.